In relationships, how we touch each other really matters. Now, touch is a really powerful way, a really important way that we can communicate with people that we care about them, and help them really feel that caring and take it in, and a way that we can really work on building trust in our relationships. I was reading a study today that highlighted a few important points that I thought I would love to share with you all. So this group of researchers asked people all over Europe where they like to be touched or are okay with being touched, and by whom. So who in your relationship circle. And they put people in categories. So your parents, your siblings, your cousins, your friends, your acquaintances, and complete and total strangers. And people would rate where on their bodies they would allow people in the different categories to touch them. After getting findings for people all over Europe, they decided, wait a minute, let's check and see if there's a cultural difference. So they went over to Japan and started asking people and did a comparison between people in the UK and people in Japan. And so the results were really fascinating. The first and most important result was that touch is tied to trust. How much you like somebody, how much you trust somebody has a lot of influence over how much you want them to touch you. And that makes sense. It makes sense in a lot of different ways. And it's not very surprising to people. But I would just suggest that we take a moment and really think about that, because it's bidirectional. There's research supporting both that we allow people we trust to touch us more often and in more different ways, and the people who touch us more often are more trusted and more liked. And this is done even in stranger studies. So when a researcher puts their hand on someone's shoulder before giving them an assignment, that researcher gets rated higher in likability at the end of whatever task people were doing than they do if they're not briefly putting their hand on someone's shoulder. That wasn't this study, but it's so fascinating that these findings are consistent, that we respond, our brains, our minds, our hearts, ourselves respond to people when they touch us with an increase of trust and liking. Now, it's important to point out that all of this connection between trust and liking and touch only applies if the touch is wanted. An unwanted touch very quickly undermines trust and creates suspicion. So it's really important to understand what your particular partner or your particular friend or your particular child likes and doesn't like. In addition to finding that relationship between trust and touch in both Japanese and UK participants, they also found that there were some pretty significant differences in the way people were comfortable being touched. For example, people in Japan were less comfortable with strangers touching their hands than people in the UK. Now, if you think about it, that makes sense, because greetings between strangers and even acquaintances and even friends and even other relationships often in the UK would involve a handshake, and in Japan would not involve any touch at all. There were other cultural differences that were a little bit less obvious. For example, people in the UK were much more comfortable with people they didn't know all that well touching their faces. And the researchers hypothesized that research has shown that people in the UK tend to touch their own faces a lot more often. And so maybe that translates to just face touching isn't as significant as touching for other parts of the body, just because face touching is part of the culture. In Japan, people were much more comfortable with their family members touching their legs and feet. Who knows why, but that was an interesting cultural finding. Another difference was that people in the UK were much more comfortable with intimate partners touching them all over than people in Japan. Although the similarity still stands, people in Japan were much more comfortable with their closer family members and closer acquaintances touching them than they were with people they knew and trusted less. There was a shift, and that touching looked a little bit different. They still weren't as comfortable as people in the UK with certain kinds of touching. While all of these things are interesting, the most important point that I came out of the study, the most important message for me, was that everybody has a different culture. Even if you grew up in the same town, you grew up in different families. And so you and your partner probably come from different backgrounds, or we all have different personalities. And so the things that we like and the things that we don't like probably are going to be unique to us. And understanding those differences can really help when we're trying to use touch as a tool to express the caring that we feel and to build confidence in each other, trust in each other, and liking for each other, to show how much we like or appreciate or support somebody. That can only be done in a way that they understand as supportive. I would suggest that you and your partner have a little moment where you sit down together and take out this diagram that the researchers used and talk about different parts of the body and how comfortable you are, how you like to be touched, whether you like to be touched in that area, and what feels good, what doesn't feel good. Get specific and use the example of ways that you've touched each other before, if you can remember, and say, that one time when we were sitting next to each other on the couch and you did this, that felt like this to me. Or when you pass by and you do this, that feels like this to me. So get very clear and very specific and use examples if you can. And then try out some new things. If you're saying to your partner, I actually love a foot massage, or I really feel good when you stroke my hand, or whatever it is, then try it out right then, right there, and try to do it in a way that doesn't demand anything from the other person. So this is one of the traps that research shows Americans tend to fall into, thinking that every touch is sexual and or romantic and has an intention behind it. And that can actually sabotage some of the power of touch in your relationship. So just for this one exercise, try very hard to touch each other in a way that doesn't ask for anything, is simply an expression of, I care about you, or I'm doing this thing that makes you feel good because I care about you, and talk to each other in those terms. You can have the whole other conversation about, use the same diagram if you want, about what turns you on and turns you off. That's a good thing to do. But for this particular conversation, maybe go ahead and just talk about touch that's affirming, touch that's supportive, touch that's connecting in a way that doesn't need to be tied to any romantic intentions. It's also good to have these kinds of conversations with your kids. Maybe don't take out the diagram, but in your head when you're sitting there and saying, hey, do you like it when I put my arm around you? Do you like it when I stroke your hair? Do you like it when I, whatever it is? And you'll be surprised sometimes that kids will say, you know what, I don't actually like that. I prefer, ask those questions. What do you prefer? What do you like when I do? Long hugs, short hugs? When is it appropriate? Don't touch me in front of my friends. As they get older, sometimes there's boundaries that shift and change. So have that ongoing conversation with your kids about what they're okay with, what they're not okay with, what they like, what they don't like. But there's also really good research about how important it is to keep touching your kids. A lot of times, especially with boys in this culture, we tend to stop touching them. And the key is to just find a way that makes sense to both of you, that you both enjoy, and go ahead and make sure that you're making a connection in that powerful, visceral way. One of the most important things about touch is that it doesn't need translation through the communication centers of the brain. When somebody touches you in a way that is supportive, you immediately get that message and feel supported when it's really working well. And that ability to make that kind of contact isn't something that we should have to shy away from or be scared of or worry about being misinterpreted. But it does take some communication around it to make sure that the messages we're trying to send are the messages that are being received. And so opening up that communication with all the people in your life is a really good idea. And use that powerful tool to increase love and trust in your relationship. They're just skills.
That's good.